Alright, so in this short video I just want to review the basics of elasticity. And so the one word you need to remember when you're thinking about measuring elasticity is responsiveness. So when we're looking at the relationship between two variables, for example, the price of a good and the quantity demanded, if we change the price, we know that that's going to lead to a change in the quantity demanded. So for example, if price goes up, we would expect the quantity demanded to fall based on our understanding of the law of demand. So the next question we would want to ask is, well, just how much did that price change? Right? We want to know not only its direction, but its magnitude of change, right? How much in absolute terms, but then more importantly, how much in relative terms. And so we would want to measure the percentage change in that price. So that's one step. Second step then is measuring the responding change in the quantity. So we'd want to know which direction it moves, the magnitude, the absolute change, right? How much did that quantity change? But then in relative terms, again, the percentage change. So if we change price by some percentage change, and that causes quantity to respond by some percentage change, we can measure both of those values. And then to measure the elasticity, we simply take the ratio. So for example, if we're measuring own price elasticity of demand, we would calculate the percentage change in quantity of the good and divide it by the percentage change in the price. And so the way I like to think about it is elasticity measures a response and a stimulus. So in the example of price and quantity, the change in the price is the stimulus, right? It's the cause. The change in the quantity then is the response, it's the effect. And so that's what elasticity comes down to, is we're always measuring the cause and effect between two related variables, such as the price of a good and its quantity demanded. Now, in the case of own price elasticity of demand, so the quantity of a good responding to a change in its own price, we know that the overall elasticity is always going to be negative. Because if you recall, the law of demand says as you raise the price of a good, its quantity demanded falls, and vice versa. And so that's why measuring direction is so important when we're measuring that percentage change, because if something like price increases, then you would get a positive percentage change. And if that leads to quantity demanded falling, you would measure that as a negative percentage change. And so because those two variables are always moving in opposite directions, when we calculate the percentage change of one, the percentage change in the other, one of those values is going to be positive, the other will be negative. And then if you take the ratio of them, the overall ratio will itself also be negative. So for own price elasticity of demand, we always know that it will be negative. Now the next question we want to ask is just how elastic was that response? So you may change the price of a good and get a really significant change in the quantity demanded. So for example, if you changed price by 2% and that resulted in a 5% change in quantity. Well, if you take 5% and divide it by that 2%, you would get an elasticity of, it would be negative 2.5, right? So negative 5% change divided by a positive 2% change, okay? So that would be negative 2.5, right? On the other hand, say that you increased the price by 10%, and the result was only a 3% change in the quantity. Quantity fell by 3%. Well, again, you take 3% divided by 10%, and you would get negative 0.3. Okay, so on the one hand, we have a measure of elasticity that is negative 2.5, and in another situation, it might be negative 0.3. So what we want to do with those values is first take the absolute value, because that's going to measure the absolute magnitude, just how much, regardless of direction. Okay. In the example where the 2% price increase caused quantity to fall by 5%, you get that negative 2.5 elasticity. And when you take its absolute value, you end up with 2.5. And then we want to compare that value to just 1 and ask, is that value greater or lesser than 1? And 2.5 obviously is greater than 1. But what that tells us, more importantly, is that the change in the quantity in relative terms was greater than the stimulus, the change in price, right? So if the price changed by 2%, quantity changed by 5%, right? The response was bigger than the stimulus. And when you take that ratio of the two, you end up with a single number whose absolute value is greater than 1. And so we would describe that as elastic. That meant there was a significant response to the stimulus. Now, in the other example where we raised the price by 10% and the quantity fell by 3%, we take -3 divided by 10. It gives us an elasticity of -0.3. When you take the absolute value of that number, you end up with just 0.3. And when we compare that to 1, we see clearly that's less than 1. And the reason is that, in this case, the response, the change in quantity, was only 3%, and that was in response to a stimulus of 10%, right? So the change in quantity was relatively smaller than the change in price. That meant the change in price, even though it was significant, 10%, it didn't really lead to a really significant change in the quantity. And so we would describe any elasticity whose absolute value is less than 1 as inelastic, meaning it doesn't respond in relative terms. Now, in some cases, you may see that some percentage change in price leads to an equal percentage change in quantity. So a 5% increase in price leads to a 5% decrease in quantity. Well, in that case, 5 divided by 5 gives you -1, and then of course you take the absolute value. And if the absolute value is equal to 1, we actually describe that as unit elastic, meaning it was a perfect 1-to-1 relationship. So just to quickly summarize, we've got two variables. A change in one leads to a change in the other. We measure the percentage change in the first variable, the stimulus, and then we measure the percentage change in the response. So for example, the price of a good and its quantity demanded. So we calculate those two percentages. We take the ratio of the response divided by the stimulus, and in the case of own price elasticity, it's always going to be negative because price and quantity will always move in different directions. So we'll get a negative value. We then take the absolute value of whatever the measured elasticity is and compare that to 1. If it's greater than 1, we describe demand as elastic, and if it's less than 1, we describe it as inelastic. Okay? So that basic process is going to be the same for every type of elasticity that we are interested in measuring. So we talked about two others in class. The cross-price elasticity. So for example, if you raise the price of jelly, how much does the quantity of peanut butter change, right? Those two goods are complements. Well, recall from our discussion of complements, if you raise the price of one complement, then the quantity of the other that people buy would decrease. So an increase in the price of jelly leads to less peanut butter being bought and sold, and vice versa. And so in that case, we're always going to get a cross-price elasticity that is negative. So complements will have a negative cross-price elasticity of demand. Substitutes, on the other hand, let's think back to our example of, say, Coke and Pepsi. If you raise the price of Coke, then you will see an increase in the quantity of Pepsi that's consumed, right? So you raise the price of one substitute, you would expect the quantity of the other substitute to rise as well. And then if you lowered the price of Coke, sales of Pepsi would go down. So in that case, the price of one substitute, the quantity of the other, always move in the same direction, right? They either both rise or both fall. And so in that case, we would expect the elasticity between substitutes to be positive. Now remember, with own price elasticity, it was always going to be negative, right? So we didn't even have to worry about that unless it was a really weird case, which we won't go into. But own price elasticity was always going to be negative. So we would just go ahead and take the absolute value. With cross-price elasticity, we do need to first ask, is the elasticity that we measure, is it positive or negative? Because that will tell us whether it is whether those two goods are complements or substitutes. Beyond that, for cross-price elasticity, you would then take the absolute value, just like we did with own price elasticity, and then compare that absolute value to 1. And if it's greater than 1, we describe the cross-price elasticity as elastic. And if the elasticity absolute value is less than 1, we describe the cross-price elasticity as inelastic, meaning there isn't much response. Now finally, the last elasticity that we're going to consider is income elasticity. And so what we're asking here is, if you change a person's income, how much does their quantity consumed of a good or service change? So for example, if my income goes up, how much does my demand for tacos go up? Assuming that tacos are a normal good. So if we assume that tacos are normal, as income goes up, I may increase my demand for tacos. If my income fell, my demand for tacos would go down. And so because income and demand for normal goods always moves in the same direction, right, both up or both down, you would always get an income elasticity that is positive. So normal goods exhibit positive income elasticity of demand. Now, on the other hand, inferior goods are going to be a little bit different. So the example we mentioned in class of inferior goods was ramen noodles. So if my income goes up, my demand for ramen noodles would fall. And if my income went back down, then my demand for ramen noodles would go back up. So for an inferior good, recall that income going up or down will lead to an inverse change in the demand for the inferior good. So what that means is that when you measure the elasticity, the income elasticity of demand for inferior goods, you would always expect the value to be negative. So again, normal goods have positive elasticity, income elasticity of demand. Inferior goods have a negative income elasticity of demand. So again, we need to ask, is the income elasticity, is it positive or negative? And then finally, just like we did with own price and cross price elasticity, whatever value we get for income elasticity, we take the absolute value, we compare that absolute value to 1, and then ask, is it greater than 1? In which case the income elasticity is relatively elastic, meaning there is a response, a significant response. On the other hand, if the income elasticity is less than 1, we describe it as relatively inelastic, meaning a change in income didn't lead to a significant change in the quantity. So, to quickly summarize, elasticity is a measure of responsiveness between two variables. If one variable changes and it causes another to change, we want to measure precisely the percentage change in the stimulating variable and the percentage change in the responding variable. We then take the responding variable's percentage change and divide it by the stimulus percentage change, and that gives us the elasticity. We looked at 3 types: own price, cross price, and income elasticity. The first question for each of those, is it positive or negative? Of course, own price elasticity will always be negative. For cross price elasticity, could be positive or negative, and income elasticity could be positive or negative. And of course, that's going to tell us whether the cross price is between complements or substitutes. The income elasticity tells us whether the good is normal or inferior. And then for all 3 of those types of elasticity, own price, cross price, and income elasticity, we take the absolute value, compare that absolute value to 1, and then if it's greater than 1, we describe it as relatively elastic. If it's less than 1, relatively inelastic. And in those rare cases when it's equal to 1, we call it unit elastic. But again, what we're measuring at the end of the day is an overall level of responsiveness between 2 variables that we have already established have a cause and effect relationship. We're just trying to better quantify and understand just how much of a response we observe.